The first time I saw his hand reach out, I knew everything was about to change. A sharp coldness spread through my body and fear tightened inside my chest. My daughter Alice sat at the dining table with her eyes lowered, unable to look up. It lasted only a brief moment, yet I understood that if I reacted too strongly, we would lose everything. That night, everything happened too quickly, as if the entire scene had already been prepared like a carefully staged play. But there was nothing I could do except sit there in silence and observe. I was a woman who had lived through countless crises, who had listened to thousands of lies, who had helped rescue more famous brands than I could count from the edge of collapse. Yet for the first time in my life, I felt completely powerless. The dinner seemed simple, just me, my daughter Alice, my son-in-law Daniel, and Susan, his mother. But I already knew that this meal would become the turning point, the beginning of changes that could not be avoided. Alice was no longer the strong daughter I once knew. When I arrived, she hugged me, but the hug felt stiff, as if every movement had been carefully calculated. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt, even though the weather outside was extremely hot, and there was an anxiety on her face that she could not hide. "Mom, I am very happy you came," she said softly, as if the sentence had been rehearsed all day. Alice had never been the type of person who tolerated meaningless conversations, yet tonight the change in her was impossible to ignore. Daniel welcomed me with a perfect smile, the smile of a man I had spent far too long shaping and observing. He was like a book that had been carefully edited so that every sentence appeared flawless, leaving no room for mistakes. But I knew that beneath that polished exterior, something was not right. Susan sat farther away, her sharp eyes watching everything, her lips curved into a constant artificial smile. I had seen that kind of smile many times before from people who tried to convince you they were your friend while their hearts were full of calculation. The meal began politely, like any ordinary family dinner. The conversation moved through unimportant subjects, traffic, real estate values, construction projects currently underway. But then, when Alice reached for a dish, the faint sound of her spoon touching the plate broke the quiet atmosphere. In that moment, I saw Daniel pause, his eyes carefully evaluating every movement she made. He looked at her for a long time, patiently, like someone deciding how far he was willing to go tonight. "Are you nervous?" Daniel asked in a low voice, not loud, but enough to make everyone at the table fall silent. Alice opened her mouth but could not say a word. She simply sat there with the spoon still in her hand, her eyes lowered. Then something I never expected happened. Daniel stood up slowly, without anger, without any sign of impatience. He walked toward Alice and grabbed her wrist tightly, squeezing until she winced in pain. He leaned down and whispered something into her ear that I could not hear clearly, but I knew it was not a word of comfort. And Susan, who had been calmly watching from a distance, broke the silence with a gentle remark. "That is how women learn their lessons." Silence fell across the table. Alice did not lift her head. Her eyes searched for me, but not for rescue. She did not need my comfort. She simply looked at me like someone seeking permission. Permission to survive. I did not react. I did not shout. I did not stand up, and I did not reach for my phone. I simply sat there and watched. I had spent my entire life studying situations like this. I could not allow emotion to take control. Emotion was my greatest enemy in that moment. All I could do was memorize every movement, every word, every glance, every small detail, because I knew that this moment was not the time to act. It was the time to prepare. Before the dinner ended, I had already made my decision. I was not a weak mother, and I was not someone who feared oppression. I had witnessed too many crises to know that in moments like this, silence can be the most powerful weapon of all. Tonight, I would not simply remain a mother who watched from the sidelines. I would become the one who wins. They did not know it yet, but they had just made the greatest mistake of their lives. The entire room was silent, with only soft music drifting from the small speaker on the cabinet. It looked like an ordinary dinner, the kind of evening that should have felt warm and comfortable, yet it felt more like a stage quietly waiting for its moment of climax. All I could sense was the suffocating air around me, like an invisible net tightening around my heart, making it hard to breathe. The meal had been prepared carefully, each plate pure white, the silver-coated spoons shining. Every dish arranged beautifully. Alice had cooked everything herself. She had always preferred preparing meals for the family on her own, a habit she learned when she was still young. But today I realized she was no longer the strong daughter I once knew. I knew Alice well. I knew she would never allow anyone to hurt her. Yet now she looked like a bird trapped inside a cage, her eyes tired, no longer filled with the bright energy and spirit she once had. The worry inside me rose little by little, like a swelling wave. I could not ignore the change in her. In the past, Alice was the one who could stand up and argue with me, always confident and decisive. She was the only person in the family who dared challenge my opinions without fearing criticism. But now her gaze had grown dim, and every answer she gave was short and hesitant, filled with unease. She was no longer herself. Daniel sat across from me, his expression unchanged, but his eyes carried a calculating brightness. He smiled politely, calmly, yet I knew that behind that smile lived control and quiet manipulation. His words sounded pleasant and smooth, but they felt like tiny needles pressing into the listener, unnoticed until the pain slowly appeared. I told you before, Alice, you need to learn to let go of certain things. Your work is too stressful, you need time to rest, Daniel said gently, but his eyes never left Alice, as if he were evaluating her, waiting for her agreement. Alice said nothing. She simply smiled faintly, a smile that clearly did not come from her heart. I could see the reluctance in every small movement she made. Yet she did not speak, she did not resist, like someone who had grown used to living under control and no longer dared to search for freedom. Susan, Daniel's mother, sat at the head of the table with a relaxed expression, like a cunning snake quietly waiting for its prey. She said nothing, yet her sharp eyes and heavy silence revealed everything. She watched Alice carefully, her gaze measuring every gesture, every movement, as if every action Alice made was a mistake that needed correction. I knew she constantly encouraged distorted ideas about a woman's role in the family. She often repeated meaningless words I had heard too many times from other women in this society. Women must learn patience. Sometimes silence and obedience are what keep a family happy. I saw Alice press her lips together slightly, her eyes still lowered, but I knew she did not agree. She simply could not fight the pressure surrounding her. She could not stand up and defend herself. And I also knew that if I spoke at that moment, I would become the troublemaker. I would be the one who shattered the quiet atmosphere they had carefully built. I sat there observing every moment, every movement. My eyes never left Alice, yet there was nothing I could do except watch. I had spent too many years listening to lies and meaningless stories people told to hide painful truths. I had spent years inside political negotiations during critical meetings where everyone concealed reality to maintain their power. But this time, it was not a meeting. This was my family, and I would not allow this to continue. As the dinner was nearing its end, I saw Alice tremble slightly when Daniel lifted his hand and placed it on hers. He did nothing dramatic. It looked like a simple gesture, yet I could clearly feel the pressure behind it. Alice looked down and did not dare lift her head, as if she refused to show resistance at that moment. A powerful surge rose inside my chest. She could not continue living like this. But I could not act impulsively. I had to wait. When dinner finally ended, Alice hurried to clear the table without saying a single word, as if she were trying to avoid my attention. I watched her and felt the exhaustion and weariness surrounding her. I said nothing, asked nothing. I simply stood up and left, but inside my mind the decision had already been made. There would be no more compromise. I would not allow my daughter to live like this for another day. They had underestimated her for far too long, but what they did not know was that I would be the one who made them pay for everything they had done. The next day, I did not call Alice the way I usually did. Those short phone calls between us had always been a daily habit every afternoon. We would talk about work, small details of life, or simply listen to each other describe a long and tiring day. But today, when I tried to call, her phone had no signal, and all I received was the message that the subscriber could not be reached. This time I was not surprised, because I had seen signs like this before. Alice had stopped calling me. It was not because she was too busy with work, and not because she did not want to call. It was because she had been surrounded by reasons she could not refuse. Those reasons had been built slowly, beginning with what seemed like harmless advice from Daniel and Susan, and gradually turning into strict expectations about her personal life and her work. With every passing day, Alice withdrew a little more into herself. She was no longer the strong, independent woman I once knew. She had become someone who had to live inside boundaries created by other people. Each time I saw her, I noticed the change in her eyes. Alice's eyes no longer carried the bright confidence they once had. Instead, they revealed exhaustion, uncertainty, and above all, fear. Fear of what? Fear that what she wanted and what she needed no longer mattered. Fear that she no longer had the right to decide her own life. And I began to realize that this change was not her choice. She had never chosen to live this way. One morning, I met Alice again at a small cafe in the city. She was still the daughter I loved, but something about her had changed. She sat across from me with her hands resting quietly on the table, palms facing downward, not even holding the cup of coffee in front of her. She no longer lifted her head confidently or spoke to me with the same comfort as before. Everything felt strained. "Mom, everything is fine," Alice said, but her voice was not convincing. She smiled, but the smile was empty, as if she were playing the role of someone she was not. I could not pretend I did not see the change. "Are you really okay, Alice?" I asked, trying not to show my worry too clearly. My question was not an accusation, it was genuine concern. It forced her to face the truth she could no longer avoid. She took a long breath and looked at me. "I'm just tired, Mom. Probably because work has been very stressful, and Daniel also said I should rest more." She laughed again, but this time I could hear the helplessness inside that laugh. I did not need to ask anything else, because I already knew the answer. But what hurt me most was hearing the way she spoke about her work. There was no passion, no excitement. The projects she once cared deeply about, the big plans she had always dreamed of completing, had now become tasks she simply carried out of obligation. Daniel had made her feel that her work was not important, that she needed to spend more time with the family. Slowly, her ideas and her projects were left behind, replaced by other priorities that had never truly been her choice. Susan was always the one pushing her. "Women with families should not be too busy with their careers, dear," she would say in a gentle voice that carried quiet pressure. Every time Alice was criticized, she forced a small smile. Then she changed a little, and eventually she became silent again. Susan always found a way to make her feel that every decision she made was wrong, that she needed to learn obedience and silence. I could not sit quietly while my daughter was pushed aside from her own life. Alice was not someone who lacked determination. She had grown up in a family where her voice was always respected. But now she was living in a world where every decision had to pass through the approval of Daniel and Susan. I realized she had gradually lost herself, not because she wanted to, but because she had been forced to live according to someone else's expectations. Finally, I decided to visit Alice's house again. This time, I was not coming only as a mother paying a visit. I came with determination. I would not allow my daughter to continue living like this. But when I arrived, I saw her sitting on the sofa with sadness in her eyes, as if she had already lost hope. I said nothing. I simply sat down beside her and held her tightly. I knew I could not save her immediately, but I would not allow her to drift any further. "You do not have to live like this, Alice. You still have so much ahead of you. You are strong. You can stand up and fight for what you deserve," I said in a low but determined voice. She did not answer right away, but I could feel a change inside her. It was the first change I had been hoping to see. She did not cry and she did not collapse, but I saw a small spark return to her eyes, as if for the first time she began to realize that her life could still change. And I would stay here with her until she found herself again. I did not know what the road ahead would look like, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never allow my daughter to live under the control of anyone. This silence would not last forever. The next day, I could not stop thinking about Alice. Every time she came to mind, I felt a heavy weight in my chest, as if a part of her life was being crushed beneath demands and pressures she could not escape. What had happened to the daughter I once knew? She used to be full of energy, confident in herself. never afraid to express her opinions, yet now she seemed like a shadow of who she used to be. She had become a woman that even I could barely recognize. I began to notice the change in our conversations. In the past, every time we met, Alice would tell me about the new projects she was working on, about creative meetings, about ideas she hoped would change the way people looked at this city. She would speak with excitement, her eyes shining whenever she talked about the future. But now when I asked about work, her answers were short and rigid, as if she were speaking only out of obligation. "Everything is fine," she would say, but I knew those were only words she used to convince herself. One afternoon, I met Alice at a small cafe she often visited when she wanted some private space. She sat quietly in the corner, the dim afternoon light making her face look pale. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt, just like the days when she still lived with me, when I would always remind her not to go out in cold weather without dressing warmly. But this time, the long sleeves were not for warmth. They felt more like a layer of protection, something to hide behind so she would not have to face the outside world. "How is work going?" I asked, trying to begin the conversation naturally the way I always had. But this time my question made Alice pause, as if she were searching for a way to answer without hurting me. "I think I might reduce my workload a little," she replied softly, yet I could clearly hear the uneasiness in her voice. Her response was not the answer of someone passionate about her career. It was the answer of someone being pressured to give up what she loved. Really, I could not hide the disappointment in my voice. I knew how important her work was to her, and I also knew that this change was not truly Alice's decision. She was no longer herself. She had begun to change according to what Daniel and Susan wanted. And I realized it was not only her work that had been affected, her entire life was being squeezed beneath a layer of control she could not escape. "Daniel thinks I should rest more," Alice added, yet I felt she was hiding something inside those words. "He says I should not work too hard, that I should spend more time with family, with him as well." I stayed silent, feeling as if an invisible knife had been driven into my heart. The name Daniel sounded like a curse, like a dark shadow surrounding Alice. I knew exactly what he had been doing to her. It was not genuine care, it was gradual control. His gentle words and thoughtful gestures were only a cover hiding manipulation. Alice had not realized it, or perhaps she had, but no longer had the strength to resist. "Do you remember when you used to talk about your projects?" I said, unable to hide the disappointment in my heart. "You always believed you could change society, change the way we look at this city. You wanted to build beautiful public spaces where people could gather and connect." Alice pressed her lips together, her eyes lowering to avoid my gaze. "Mom, I just want everything to stay peaceful," she said quietly, her voice tired and heavy. "I want to keep harmony. I want to avoid conflict. Daniel, he just wants me to spend more time with him." Her words felt like a sharp blade cutting into my chest. My daughter was no longer the strong woman who stood up for her ideals. Alice had become someone who lived for others, someone who followed what others wanted instead of living for herself. That was not love. It was a kind of quiet brainwashing. And I, her mother, had been too slow to recognize it. "You do not have to sacrifice yourself to please others, Alice," I said gently but firmly. "You have the right to live for yourself, the right to pursue what you love. You do not have to turn yourself into someone else just to satisfy someone." Alice did not respond. She simply sat there in silence, sadness in her eyes. I did not know what more I could do. I had already lost too much time while my daughter was pulled into a spiral she could not escape on her own. But I would not allow her to remain trapped in this darkness any longer. I knew my daughter still had a chance to take back her life, and I would help her do it. But this time I could not remain only an observer. This time I would have to act. I spent many nights sitting quietly, looking through old photographs of Alice, pictures I had kept through all the years of her growing up. She had always been a confident child, full of life, always dreaming about the good things she wanted to do for the world. But now when I looked at her, I saw only a tired woman whose eyes no longer carried the bright enthusiasm they once had. I knew it was not Alice who had changed. It was the world around her that had pressed down on her for so long that she could no longer recognize herself. Gradually, I began to notice clearer signs of the change in her. She no longer visited me the way she used to. Her phone calls became more and more rare. Evenings that we once spent talking together had now turned into silence. I did not know whether she was trying to avoid me, but I could clearly feel that something was wrong. Each time we met, she seemed more distant, no longer the strong daughter I had raised. One afternoon, I went to Alice's house without calling first, hoping to have a real conversation with her. When I arrived, the door was open, but the house no longer felt warm the way it once did. Alice was sitting in the living room, her eyes fixed on the window as if she were trying to escape the thoughts inside her head. She wore a simple t-shirt, her hair loose, no longer trying to maintain the perfect appearance she once cared about. "Hello, Mom," she said when she saw me, but her voice no longer carried the warmth it once had. The greeting felt more like a polite formality. I saw her quickly turn away, as if she did not want me to notice the exhaustion in her eyes. "It has been a long time since you called me, Alice," I began gently, making sure there was no accusation in my voice. "I know your work keeps you busy, but you do not have to avoid me like this." Alice did not answer right away. She sat down in a chair, looked at her hands, then turned her gaze back to the window. After a moment, she sighed, as if trying to find words to explain something she could not say. "I am just tired, Mom," Alice said, staring into the empty space in front of her. "Daniel says I need to spend more time with family. He says I should not work so hard anymore, and I should not meet friends too often either. Everything has become difficult, Mom." As I listened, I felt a fire rising inside me. Alice's words sounded like a cry for help that she could not say directly. She was being pushed into a corner with no way out, and I could not sit still while my daughter slowly destroyed herself. Yet I remained quiet, not rushing to speak. I understood that what she needed was not blame, but help, a path that could lead her out of this endless cycle. "You do not have to live like this, Alice," I said, unable to hide the worry in my voice. "You are a strong person. You have the right to choose your life. You have the right to decide your work, to decide what makes you happy." Alice looked at me, but her eyes did not show understanding. They were filled with sadness and exhaustion. She said nothing, only lowered her head as if she did not want to face the truth. I could see she was struggling within herself, not because she did not want to live the life she desired, but because Daniel and Susan had convinced her that her life must always place others first. "I do not know what to do anymore, Mom," she said, her voice sounding completely broken. "I have done everything they asked. I thought that if I behaved well, everything would be fine. But now I feel like I am losing myself. I cannot do anything without thinking about their opinions." Every word Alice spoke felt like a blade cutting into my heart. I could see the sadness in her eyes that she could no longer hide, the disappointment and anxiety pressing down on her spirit. My Alice was never meant to be a weak woman like this. Yet, she had been forced to endure too much control, too many rules that were never her choice. I could not sit still anymore. I could not allow my daughter to continue living in a world she could not escape. I knew that if I did not act now, if I did not help Alice find herself again, I would lose her forever. "You do not have to do that, Alice. You can stand up and take your life back," I said as I held her hand firmly so she could not pull away. "I will help you. We will find a way out of this control together. But you must believe in yourself. You must be brave enough to face the truth." Alice looked at me, and for the first time in many months, I saw a small spark of light in her eyes. She did not answer immediately, but I knew that deep inside she had begun to understand that her life did not belong to Daniel, and it did not belong to Susan. Her life belonged to her. "Thank you, Mom," Alice whispered, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. I held her tightly and did not want to let go, because I knew that from this moment, Alice had begun to find herself again, and I would never allow her to face these storms alone. In the days following that meeting, I felt a certain sense of relief in my heart, yet I could not escape the worry that rose every time I thought about Alice. She had begun to open up more, begun to face the things she once tried to push away. But I knew that was only the first step. Once again, I had to sit down, look at everything clearly, and prepare for what was about to come. because I understood very well that this battle was not just a simple conversation. It required much more than that. When I looked back at Alice's life, I could not help asking myself what had changed her so much. How could a strong, confident woman full of ambition like Alice fall into a world where she was no longer herself? I began to revisit details I had not noticed before. I remembered the times I met Daniel and Susan, the calculating look in their eyes, the gentle words that carried quiet pressure whenever they spoke to Alice. One late afternoon, while I was cleaning around the house, an unexpected message appeared on my phone. It was an email with no subject line, containing only a single sentence. Daniel's mother is not the person you think she is. At first, I assumed it was some kind of joke, but when I opened the email, I realized the information inside could not be ignored. In that moment, I felt a strange sensation rise within me, as if I had just discovered a piece of a puzzle I had been searching for far too long. The message was not simply a warning. It was an invitation to open the door to a world I had never known, a world filled with secrets, hidden behind the perfect image Daniel and Susan had built. I continued opening each document, not realizing how close I was getting to disturbing truths. Every message, every phone call, every detail pointed back to Susan and Daniel's past. She had been manipulating everyone in that family for a very long time, and Daniel was not innocent. He was the product of a system she had built since he was a child. Her teachings had never been love. They were training, strategies designed to control the people around them. I felt as though I were opening a dusty book, yet each page revealed secrets I could never have imagined. Then I found a police report about an event I had never heard of before. It was the death of Daniel's father, a strange accident. His death had been described as a fall, but the document suggested there were many unusual details. There were injuries that could not be explained, witness statements that had been altered, details that seemed deliberately blurred. But the most striking thing was a note in the file, a comment from a young investigator who had recorded observations that no one else appeared to notice. It was not just a fall, the investigator wrote. The injuries do not match a fall. There are signs of impact from another object. The death of Daniel Sr. was not a random event. It was part of a pattern I had not been able to see until now. Daniel had grown up in a family where control, domination, and even violence were not unusual. I suddenly realized that Susan had created a system in which everything had to follow her will, and now she had passed that system on to her son, Daniel. I could not stop thinking about what I had just read. What I once believed were ordinary family stories were actually hidden tragedies. Susan was not simply a mother. She was a woman who had spent years building an empire of power within her own family. She had not only manipulated Daniel, she had manipulated Alice as well. I had failed to see this clearly before, and I realized that everything Alice was experiencing was not random. It was the result of a plan that had been in motion for a long time. With every detail I uncovered, my worry grew stronger, but I also knew I could not turn back. I now had enough evidence to understand that I was not simply facing a controlling man. I was confronting a system, a structure that Susan had built and maintained quietly within that family for years, and I could not allow Alice to continue living inside that darkness. The decision had become clear. I could no longer stand by and watch. I would do everything possible to protect my daughter. But I also knew this battle would not be easy, because my opponent was not only Daniel. It was an entire system that had existed and operated quietly within that family for many years. And no matter how strong I was, I could not do it completely alone. But now I had a weapon in my hands, the truth. And that truth, no matter how difficult it might be, would become the light that illuminated every dark corner of that house. After the secrets about Daniel's family slowly began to reveal themselves, I could not stop thinking about everything that had happened. The information in the email, the old police reports, and the details I discovered about Susan and Daniel's past made me feel as if a violent storm was rising inside me. I could not stop anymore. What I had uncovered was not simply a private family matter. It was an entire system, a mechanism of power hidden behind smiles, sweet words, and the performance of a perfect family. Alice did not realize that she was living inside a trap. She had gradually been pulled into a spiral of control and manipulation, changing from a strong woman into a faint shadow within her own life. And I, her mother, was the only person who could help her escape that endless cycle. I had already prepared myself for the confrontation, but I could not act immediately. Everything had to be calculated carefully, step by step, because I knew that if I made even one wrong move, I could lose Alice forever. She was living in a state of inner conflict, and I could not rush her. I had to give her time to understand that she was not a victim, but someone who had the right to decide her own life. One afternoon, Alice and I sat together in a quiet cafe, a place we used to visit to talk about the small details of life. She looked at me with eyes full of uncertainty. I knew she was facing an important decision, and I would be the one helping her reach it. "Mom, I feel exhausted," Alice said, her voice trembling as if these words were the result of a long battle inside her heart. "I do not know if I can continue living like this." I remained silent, waiting, not to pressure her, but to give her space. I understood that she did not need criticism. She needed support, a space where she could look at herself honestly. I also knew that change could only come when she realized she deserved a life of freedom, not a life bound by someone else's control. "I have done everything to please them, Mom," Alice continued, her eyes resting on the cup of coffee she had not touched. "I listened to every piece of advice from Daniel and his mother. I thought that if I behaved well, everything would be fine, but now I feel like I'm losing myself." "No, Alice," I said firmly. "You do not need to change who you are to satisfy them. You are yourself, and you have the right to live the life you want. You do not have to sacrifice yourself for anyone." My words felt like a flash of lightning breaking through the quiet air of the cafe. Alice lifted her head and her eyes suddenly brightened, though hesitation still lingered in them. I understood that she was not yet ready to face the truth completely. She was afraid, worried about the consequences that change might bring. But I also knew she would never find happiness if she continued to live in fear and under the control of others. "I do not want you to do anything you are not ready for," I continued gently but firmly. "But you must know that you have the right to choose your own life. And if you want to change, I will always stand beside you." Alice remained silent, saying nothing. Yet I could see the conflict in her eyes, the struggle within her heart. She wanted to escape, but she was afraid of what might come next. She feared losing everything, feared that her choices would hurt the people around her. In that moment, I understood that fear is not something we can easily remove. But I also knew that if Alice did not face that fear, she would live in darkness forever. "You have the right to decide, Alice," I added, my voice soft but strong. "I cannot live your life for you, but I can help you find yourself again. I watched you grow up, I saw how strong you are, and I know you are not someone meant to live under pressure. You deserve a life of freedom." Alice looked at me, and a gentle light slowly appeared in her eyes, as if she had realized something important. She did not answer immediately, but I knew that inside her heart, those thoughts had begun to grow. I could not know exactly what would happen next, but I believed that this time Alice was ready for change, and I would never allow her to walk that path alone. A moment later, Alice took my hand and looked at me with deep gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Mom," she said, her voice softer now. "I will think about everything you told me, and I will find a way to live honestly with myself." I nodded and smiled without saying anything more, because I knew that although the road ahead would still be full of challenges, Alice now had the strength to face them, and I would always stand beside her, helping her find her own path again. For the entire past week, I could not stop thinking about what Alice had said, about the change I knew she was slowly beginning to accept. Yet every time I saw her, I still noticed the exhaustion, the quiet discouragement, and the confusion in her eyes that she could not hide. She had begun to open up more, but the fear was still there. Fear that if she did something different, she would have to pay a price. I understood that although she had begun to recognize the control around her, she had not truly stepped out of its shadow yet. I had already prepared myself for this confrontation. What I knew for certain was that Alice could not continue living in a marriage where she was no longer herself. But she also could not make that decision alone without help. She had become too accustomed to living according to other people's wishes, too used to sacrificing herself in order to please those around her. And I was the only person who could help her realize that she deserved a life of freedom, a life not bound by anyone else. One early morning, I went to visit Alice at her house. This time, I did not arrive with worry in my heart, but with determination. She was sitting there at the dining table, the light from the window falling across her face and making it look almost blurred, like a painting without clear lines. Alice looked at me, but there was something in her eyes that made me feel as though we were standing in two different worlds. "Hello, Mom," Alice said, but her voice sounded as if it carried no life within it. She was exhausted, but I could not allow that to stop me. "Hello, Alice," I replied firmly. "I came here for a reason. Today I want to talk about what you are facing." Alice lifted her head slightly, her eyes dimming, as if she already guessed what I was about to say. I knew she had thought about this before, had worried about the consequences she might face if she chose to change. I understood that fear, but I also knew she could not continue living under the shadow of it. "You need to stop and truly think about what you want," I began, my voice calm and understanding. "I know you are afraid. You are afraid of losing everything you have built, afraid of losing family, losing stability. But you cannot live your whole life in fear." Alice lowered her head and gripped her coffee cup tightly. She said nothing, yet I could see the struggle in her eyes. She was not ready to face the truth completely. She was still worried about choosing between a life filled with fear and a life where she could decide freely for herself. "You do not have to sacrifice yourself for anyone, Alice," I continued, looking directly into her eyes so she would understand that these were not empty words, but the sincere voice of a mother who understood the pain she was carrying. "You have the right to choose your own life. You do not have to live for anyone else, especially not according to what Daniel and his mother expect from you." "But, Mom, I cannot," Alice began, then stopped. She sighed and looked down at her hands as if searching for a reason to explain the heaviness in her heart. "I do not want to hurt them. I do not want to disappoint them." I gently placed my hand on hers and felt the tension in her body. "Alice, you have to understand that living for others does not always mean loving them. You cannot constantly sacrifice yourself just to make someone happy, because in the end you will be the one who suffers. You cannot live a life without knowing who you truly are." I watched as her eyes slowly began to brighten. I knew she was starting to understand that loving the people around her did not mean turning herself into someone else to satisfy them. She was not the only one who had to change in this marriage. "You cannot keep living like this forever," I added firmly. "I do not want you to abandon your dreams. You should not have to live in this darkness for another day." Alice remained silent for a long moment before finally lifting her head. Her eyes searched mine as if she were looking for reassurance. "Do you really think I can do it, Mom?" she asked hesitantly, as if she were asking herself more than asking me. "You can, Alice. I know you can. You are strong. You do not have to live under anyone's control anymore. You have the right to choose and to live the life you want," I said steadily, leaving no room for doubt in my voice. She sat there quietly, still saying nothing, but I knew something inside her had begun to change. This confrontation was not only about convincing Alice, it was about helping her realize that the power had always been in her hands. Fear would no longer control her. She would not have to continue living a life she did not want, and I would always stand beside her while she found herself again. Finally, Alice nodded gently. "I will think about everything you said," she whispered. "I will find a way to live honestly with who I really am." And in her eyes, I could see the first spark of determination slowly beginning to grow. The next morning, when I woke up, thoughts about Alice confronting Daniel kept circling in my mind. I knew this confrontation would not be only her personal matter. It would become a struggle that the entire family would eventually witness. Alice was no longer the fragile daughter I once saw. She had discovered her own strength. But to step out of the shadow of control and manipulation, she would have to fight not only Daniel, but also a system that had been built over many years. The tension inside me did not fade. I understood that the moment Alice chose to face the truth, nothing would be as simple as she imagined. Daniel and Susan would never give up easily. They had grown accustomed to controlling everything around them. And I knew very well that if we were not careful, Alice could fall straight into the trap they had prepared. Every step we took had to be carefully calculated. I was not simply standing by and watching anymore. I had a plan. I had gathered every piece of evidence I could find. Phone calls, messages, notes in the documents I had uncovered, all of them were pieces of the puzzle we would need for this battle. We were not only fighting to save Alice, we were also fighting to shatter the illusion of the perfect family that Daniel and Susan had built. One late afternoon, Alice came to see me at the small house she had just rented. She walked in with a completely different presence, no longer the exhausted and distant woman I had seen before. Her eyes burned with intensity, not from happiness but from determination. She was ready to face the life she had chosen. And now she was not standing up only for herself. She was standing up for every woman who had been trapped in silence the way she had been. "Mom, I have decided," Alice said, her voice steadier than I had ever heard it. "I will ask for a divorce. I will not allow Daniel and his mother to control my life any longer." I looked at her and felt the strength in every word she spoke. There was no doubt left, no exhaustion or fear. My Alice had returned, not guided by the decisions of others, but by her own beliefs. And I knew no one would be able to stop her now. Yet the moment I heard those words, I also knew the road ahead would not be easy. Daniel and Susan would never accept defeat quietly. They had grown used to manipulating everything, and now they would do anything necessary to keep the power they had built. Alice's decision was not something Daniel and Susan would ever welcome. They would try to turn her into the weak woman they once controlled, using every trick they could to pull her back. And I, as her mother, could not allow that to happen. The next day, we began preparing the necessary steps. Alice met with a lawyer, and I stood beside her like a shield, ready to fight for her until the very end. But as soon as the legal process began, I realized we were facing something far larger than we expected. Almost immediately, a wave of resistance started rising around us. 1 week later, one of Alice's former colleagues began avoiding her. A longtime friend suddenly stopped contacting her. A major project she had been leading was removed from her responsibility without any clear explanation. Everything slowly began to change. Decisions related to Alice's career, opportunities connected to her work, all seemed to shift mysteriously, and every thread led back to people she once trusted. "Something is wrong," Alice said to me with worry. "Everything is changing too quickly. It feels like someone is interfering with everything I do." I said nothing, but deep inside, I understood exactly what was happening. This was the strategy Susan and Daniel used. They could not attack me directly, but they could do everything necessary to corner Alice. They would isolate her, make her feel as though she no longer had a place in the world around her. And I knew they would not stop there. Not long after that, an anonymous complaint was sent to my company accusing me of dishonest conduct in my work. The claims in that complaint were pure lies, but the intention behind them was obvious: to destroy my reputation and erase the trust I had built over so many years. I could not allow things to go any further. This was no longer only my problem, it was Alice's as well. "We cannot stop now," I told Alice when she came to visit me that evening. "We have come too far to turn back. We must stay strong. We must keep fighting." Alice looked at me, her eyes filled with determination. "I will not give up, not anymore." And in that moment, I knew we would not stop until the truth was revealed. We would never allow them to continue manipulating our lives. Everything had changed, and we would face whatever came next together. In the days after the divorce decision was made, Alice's life seemed a little less tense, yet everything that had happened continued to haunt me. The phone calls, the legal meetings, the indirect threats from Daniel and Susan, all of it surrounded us constantly. Even so, I could not turn back. Alice was no longer the fragile girl I once saw. She had chosen her path, and I would walk beside her until the very end. A week after filing for divorce, I began to notice a change in Alice. She no longer avoided me. Her eyes were brighter now, no longer clouded the way they had been before. She was slowly finding herself again, step by step. Even though life still held many challenges, I knew that Alice was no longer anyone's victim. She had taken back control of her own life. One day, while I was working at home, I received a phone call. I did not look at the screen immediately, but the moment I heard the voice on the other end, I recognized it. It was Alice. Her voice sounded tense, yet there was also a strength in it that I had never heard before. "Mom, I have decided to meet Daniel," she said, and I could feel the determination in her words. "I need to talk to him, not to fix anything, but to close everything. I need to look at him, face what happened, so I will not be afraid anymore." Hearing this, I did not know whether to feel worried or proud. My Alice had returned. She was no longer trembling before the man who once controlled her life. But I also knew this meeting would not be easy, and I could not let Alice face it alone. "Are you sure about this, Alice?" I asked, unable to hide the concern in my voice. "It will not be easy, and I do not want you to face Daniel's psychological games." Alice was silent for a moment, then she answered firmly, "I am not afraid anymore, Mom. I just want to end everything. I do not want this anymore. I do not want to live in silence and manipulation anymore. I want to see him so I will know that I was not wrong." And so, after so many delays, Alice finally decided to face Daniel. The meeting took place in a familiar setting for them, a room inside a lawyer's office building. I was not inside the room, but I knew she was not alone. I was always beside her, following every step she took. Even though we had prepared ourselves for what might happen, I still could not stop worrying. When I received a message from Alice after the meeting, I finally felt a little relief. She had faced Daniel, not with fear, not to ask for forgiveness, but to end everything that had begun the day she met him. "I told him everything, Mom. No threat can make me go back anymore. I have nothing left to say to him. I will not allow myself to be dragged back into that chaos again. I will divorce him and I will not look back." I could not hold back my emotions. Tears filled my eyes. My Alice had become strong. She had stood up for herself. Her words were not about forgiveness and not about surrender. They were a declaration of her right to live, a declaration that she was not part of the world Daniel and Susan had created. She had cut every invisible thread that once tied her to that life. But I knew the story did not end there. What worried me most was the legal battle we would face in the coming weeks. People like Daniel and Susan do not give up easily. They would use everything they had to protect the image they had spent so long building. But we were not afraid, because now we had the truth in our hands. This legal battle was not only about property or custody, it was a fight for the recognition of personal freedom. And I would not allow Alice or any of us to live under the shadow of control ever again. Daniel and Susan could not change the truth. The truth had already been revealed, and all they had left were lies and dirty tactics. Even so, we kept moving forward. With my support and the help of close friends, Alice slowly began rebuilding her life. She no longer had to live in fear or dependence. She no longer had to step back in the face of injustice. And I, her mother, would always stand beside her, helping her fight for her own life. Our story was not only about divorce or a legal battle. It was a story about strength, about rediscovering oneself and claiming the right to freedom. And if there is one thing I learned from this journey, it is that truth has the power to break down every wall. And in the end, it is the truth that becomes justice. In the end, this story is not only about Alice and me. It is the story of everyone who is living under control, everyone who is facing manipulation and fear. The truth may be hidden for a while, but eventually it will find its way into the light. And when you choose to stand up for yourself, when you dare to face your fear and reclaim your power, nothing can stop you. If this story touches your heart, remember that you are not alone. Share your story and do not let it disappear into silence. Sometimes a single word, a small action can change someone's life. Keep standing up, keep fighting, and help others discover their own strength. Please like, share, and leave a comment about your story. If you feel that this message matters, do not forget to subscribe so you can continue following more stories and find the support you need. You deserve to live your life freely and happily.